Welcome into Red Raider Recon. I'm Clint Scott. He's Rob Bro.
I am Rob Bro. This week, we're talking about beef.
Roast beef?
No, stop.
Leviathans. Big Nasties. Hog Mollies. Beef.
The offensive line is similar to almost every position group for Texas Tech football. The big boys will have a mix of familiar faces and impact transfers as they aim to protect Baron Morton and open holes for the running back room. Two key returners are Sheridan Wilson at center and Davian Carter at guard. Wilson won the center job coming out of preseason camp last year and held it down starting all 13 games. A big headline in the offseason was the blanket waiver of eligibility given to players who spent time at the JUCO level. That gave Carter an extra year, which he chose to use. Last season was Carter's first as a Red Raider, starting 12 games at right guard. New faces out of the transfer portal include Howard Sampson from North Carolina, Hunter Zambrano from Illinois State, Will Jados from Miami of Ohio, and Cash Cleveland from Colorado. Sampson was the second-ranked tackle in the transfer portal and is expected to start at left tackle. Zambrano was the first commitment in the impressive transfer portal class, a 6-year player competing for the right tackle spot. Jados is a 5th-year senior who started in 39 games for the Red Hawks. He'll look to win the left guard position. Cleveland was the late May addition. Last season with the Buffaloes, he was a freshman All-American at center. He'll back up Sheridan Wilson. Vinny Sciury, Jacob Ponton, and Daniel Sill are 3 more names that are either competing for a starting spot or will see the field as key reserves. Sciury was a highly touted transfer from last year's class, but after being injured in the second game of the season, he was forced to redshirt. Cash Cleveland and Jacob Ponton are the youngest of the group. Ponton is a redshirt freshman who got his first start in the Liberty Bowl, but also appeared in Tech's matchups with North Texas, Colorado, and West Virginia. Sill is a redshirt sophomore who's a versatile backup with high upside. Last season, he was originally a backup at right guard, but moved to right tackle later in the season. In total, that's 2,770 pounds of mass, looking to make a big impact in 2025.
Dude, we've got to stop making Arby's jokes. Josh, he said he was going to stop, editing for
I'm
us.
sorry, I just forgot. I really like the Arby's jokes.
I mean, he's a vegan.
He's pretty
They
sensitive.
have the meats.
Said he was going to grab us by our short and curly fries.
The offensive we are talking offensive line this week. And I've said, on the end of the bench, on maybe Tech Talk, and various other places, that the Texas Tech offensive line, I think, personally, was better than it got credit for in the last 2 seasons. I mean, you don't have a 1,500-yard rusher like Taj Brooks without being decent on the offensive line. But I think the issue at Texas Tech has certainly been depth. And I also think we undervalued Caleb Rogers in his final couple of seasons because he's a guy who had he was on the Feldman's Freaks list, incredible athleticism, played right tackle. They really wanted him to play guard the last 2 seasons, and he just did not have enough bodies. Because at Texas Tech in the last 3 years, 4 years, 10 years, 12 years, you've had maybe 3 quality offensive Big 12 linemen, or 2, or maybe in some years 4. And I think Caleb Rogers was underrated in that respect. And then moving forward on this year, we'll talk about it. I think you might finally have 5 quality offensive linemen.
I think everybody in college football can use a Caleb Rogers. 55 consecutive starts. Just go there. I mean,
yeah.
When you talk about Ironman player, which by the way is the most for an offensive lineman in Texas Tech history.
Yeah, right tackle,
It's the second most for all players. The only one in front of him, Jalen Hutchings, who had 57 career starts. I'm totally with you. I think he was a very pliable offensive lineman. I do think he was a guy that could do a lot of things. And you were able to, because you needed to, move him from spot to spot. And I'm totally with you. I had this written down when I was just refreshing my mind of what his career was. Because obviously he starts in the Wells era and then ends up in the McGuire era. I think for the McGuire era, and I guess you'd go for the Wells era too, I think he might be the most underappreciated player that you've seen there. Just because when you talk about or at least in that conversation, because when you talk about Ironman players, it's just hard to talk about offensive line in that way. One, I think it is the hardest jump from high school to college football. I'm not saying other positions are easy, but when you look at maybe wide receiver, some things you can do with the running back spot, maybe in the secondary. The smaller, quote unquote, smaller bodied positions maybe are slightly easier. Offensive line, defensive line, the trenches, when you're trying to build up some of that Division I college weight in mass, it's really hard. And so just the fact that he got that much playing time because you needed him to, and then was solid his entire career, I think is something that you're looking at maybe some of the young guys that have been brought in the last couple of classes and going, if you were here while he was here, hopefully that's something that you picked up.
Yeah, and if Jacob Ponton had been here in 2020, he's probably starting as a true freshman. And so I think a lot of that is necessity. But tying it into this year's unit, you don't have to play a guy just because you're looking for your top five, your best five, which is so often what you do in college football. It's, hey, you might have played left tackle. You might have 5 left tackles playing offensive line in college football because it's your top 5. And, hey, you can learn how to snap a ball. Oh, you're 6'4", you're 6'6", you're 6'3", but you played tackle in high school? Well, welcome to center. You're a guard now. And I think you've tried to shoehorn guys in the recent past. I think you might have 6 quality Big 12 offensive linemen if Zambrano makes the jump, if Jados can play guard, if Vinny Sciury starts, Cash Cleveland. I mean, you just have a bunch of bodies. That's not even mentioned Davian Carter, who's one of the top returning guards in the Big 12 on PFF. Sheridan Wilson, the same on PFF at center. And then Howard Sampson, who was the number 2 tackle in the class, period,
number 14,
in the transfer
number
portal.
14 overall.
I think if you're just like reading names off a depth chart this season, you have to feel better than in the past.
I don't want to take shots at like Dalton Merriman or Ty Buchanan or guys like that you said goodbye to. But I think they left because it was very clear that that's a position that you weren't just trying to restock or something like that. You were trying to upgrade, and you were actively trying to do it. And hopefully all those guys have great success in their careers as they move on. But I think that was, you go back to after the Colorado game and the infamous tweet to Cody Campbell, buy us an offensive line, which, by the way, all of this stuff was already in the works. I mean, probably 2 or 3 months in the works at this point. And he says, I will. And that was the mindset in the offseason. But before we get to some of the new names, some of the names that you kept, 2 of them that you mentioned, that will be your right guard and your center. It's Davian Carter at right guard and Sheridan Wilson at center. I think it was huge, really important that you kept both of those guys. I think for Carter, his story was so interesting because you have that blanket waiver for JUCO guys that get an extra year. And then you have to go, just because you have that extra year, and you could do this with the COVID year conversation too, just because they get that extra year doesn't mean guys are necessarily going to take it. Sometimes they're ready to move on, or for him, maybe explore professional options. But you convince him to stay, chooses to stay. And now, one of the best pass blocking guards in college football. And that's just not an opinion. The grades and numbers will back that up. Sheridan Wilson was a top 4 pass blocking center last year. And of the returning ones, it's him and Wake Forest's center. So, I know that's going just from one facet of blocking, but still those guys, especially Sheridan Wilson, who won that out of camp as a sophomore, and you have a couple of years, this will obviously be Carter's last year. I think it's really important to have those guys. Maybe. That we'll see.
Yeah, we've got another waiver in there.
Yeah.
Dr. Carter.
Dr. Carter. I like that. Who was did you know Stetson Bennett? Did you see the thing on him? He played college football forever and didn't get his degree or something.
Oh, yeah, I think he had some other troubles.
Well, true.
Yeah.
Anyways, side note, but I think for getting new faces that you have, just because they're talented, I think it's important to have guys that you trust that can help gel things together, which is something that I think you looked at what Caleb Rogers was able to do, and now you're saying Davian Carter, Sheridan Wilson. This is your job. It's still hold down your positions and play well, but you've got to add some chemistry because you're the guys that have been in the system, that have been with the staff, and know what we want.
Yeah, both of those guys, I would say, premier pass blockers in the Big 12 last year, and you kind of have to throw out the Colorado game in that respect because nobody was good against Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that Davian Carter is a quality Big 12 offensive lineman. And you mentioned Merriman and Buchanan earlier, and Porche to that respect.
Sure.
Because all three of them could have come back, and I would use the P word on them. They were processed. I think you obviously wanted to upgrade at those positions. If you go back even a year further, I think you would have loved to have kept Monroe Mills, who went to Louisville with Tyler Shuck. This year, I think you chose to return Davian Carter. And in the nature of the transfer portal, Sheridan Wilson could have left even after you brought in Cash Cleveland. He could have said, well, if you're bringing in another center, I'm leaving. He could start. And he didn't. He stayed. So I think those two guys, and look, new offensive coordinator, could be some new terminology. I would wonder if you have some like Texas Tech terminology that Mac Leftwich assumes, and maybe some new verbiage or schemes that he brings in. But you continue with the same offensive line coach, Steve Farmer. Nope. Clay McGuire.
There you go. Steve
Farmer was a Wells guy. I'm glad he left. Well, sorry. No disrespect. And so... And another thing. I think it was really important to bring those two guys back. And, a returner, right, Vinny Sciury as well. I'm wondering, pondering, if Vinny Sciury is going to start at left guard, but he didn't play in the spring, and so Will Jados is kind of penciled in there because he earned the job in the spring. I wonder who the starting five will be in fall camp. But again, in years past, it was like, well, who knows who the best five are? Doesn't really matter who starts. It's Caleb Rogers and a gang of misfits. And Monroe Mills and Caleb Rogers are pretty good, but then they flipped him one year and he wasn't really a fit at left tackle. I think you could say the same sentence this year. You at least start the same sentence and say, well, I don't know who the starting five are going to be. Instead of, you have one guy and maybe four others. It's like there's six guys that I could legitimately say could be starters here. I'm not as sold on Will Jados just because of what he did at Miami of Ohio, but he started a bunch of games, and year before last, I think, was an all-conference guy at tackle. Now he's projected at guard.
Sure.
But I think Howard Sampson's quality Big 12. I think as you kind of start to look at some new faces, I think Cash Cleveland is a freshman All-American, is a guy who can grow into something and could certainly play. I think another young guy, Ponton, is a returner, but he could grow into something. And then you have Zambrano, FCS All-American. Davian Carter, solid. Sheridan Wilson, solid. Howard Sampson, solid. And then I think Vinny Sciury was a highly touted prospect last year out of the portal that you didn't get to see much past game two. And then Will Jados, who I'd probably put 7th or 8th, but they have him in the top 5. So
let's go. Let's keep talking about then two names you said there before we get to the new faces and talk about Vinny Sciury and Jacob Ponton, because all of a sudden Ponton, if you are an offensive line fan, is on your radar. He appears in 3 regular season games, and I mean it is the brisk type of appear. 8 snaps against North Texas, a couple against West Virginia, a couple against Colorado. But then he's kind of the forgotten freshman from the bowl game, because he starts at left tackle and he's one of 4 to start there on the offense. And of course, that conversation, there's no way it wasn't going to be dominated first by Hammond and then by your running backs there in Dickey and Williams, who you're obviously just going to talk about those positions anyways, but also with who they were replacing for that game. One for the running backs replacing Taj Brooks, who wouldn't be back, and then the other, some like, boy, if Hammond goes and tears it up against Arkansas, quarterback battle coming. But no one talked about Jacob Ponton, right? Offensive line, you get no love. And he was really good in that game. And really big frame. Another year older, you're hearing things from like Coach McGuire from this summer depth chart that we have right now. Obviously, he's the backup, both tackles, both sides.
You call that a swing tackle.
a swing, and but also maybe a little bit of a battle at right tackle between him and Zambrano. And when I think battle with this, I kind of go in my mind some of the battles we talked about with like Shuck and Morton, where it's like, yeah, they're certainly competing for that spot. But Tyler Shuck was already starting a couple steps ahead in that conversation.
Yeah.
And I don't know what percentage that is. If it was like, hey, Zambrano's 65, 65-35, something like that, or if it's 80-20, or if it's 55-45. I don't know how close Ponton is, but I know he actually is in the mix and we'll see him. But that's suddenly a guy that is with Cash Cleveland, the two youngest of the group, who I think you'll see on the field this year for a considerable amount of time, even if it's out of a reserve role. And you go, man, that's a kid with a bright future that even with you're excited, if he were to break onto the field this year, you'd be excited about him. But also, what can he do when some of these guys that you've brought in, when they move on? I mean, for one side, like Zambrano, that's a one-year guy, so you would think if he doesn't beat him this year, then that would be somewhat of a predestined spot for Ponton next year. But either way, I think he's added an interesting element to the conversation for this offensive line, because it's been a little bit out of nowhere.
When you specifically look at Ponton and Zambrano, and you look at Joey McGuire's decisions on depth charts in his first 3 seasons, and he kind of gives the edge to experience. Mm-hmm. Now, sometimes it's Power 5 experience, sometimes it's Big 12 experience, sometimes it's just grown man experience. And especially in the offensive line, I think the camp will open with Zambrano as the right tackle, but you want those in pencil. And especially at offensive line, you want to be pushed. Mm-hmm. And if a guy's not playing well, the next guy will come in. And so I would say Vinny Sciury has a better shot at winning the job out of camp. And then Will Jados is another guy who can have some versatility, some cross training, as they used to call it in the Matt Wells era. But I do think that Ponton is a guy who, I don't know, maybe you have a run blocking offensive line and a normal offensive line, and maybe you bring in some extra big bodies, and maybe Ponton's the fourth tight end, and you run some tackle over or something.
Yeah,
I called Tharp last year the right tackle.
Yeah,
maybe Ponton or one of these other guys is the right tackle this year, and you bring him in to have some extra beef on the offensive line. So that's more tackle over than extra tight end, but same mindset.
Extra beef, like a large number one.
Okay, all right.
Oh, sorry. Vinny Sciury.
Yeah.
Obviously another player there.
You're a double or half pound guy. All right.
Oh, Josh hates us so much. Sciury, I think the interest with him for me is, there was a shot that he was going to be at least in the running for your best offensive lineman last year. And to me, some of the questions around him are kind of a combination between questions that I have for Zambrano and questions I have for Jados when you mix it together, because now, one, obviously Sciury, you're coming off of an injury. And then two, you're not making the Zambrano level jump, but you are making the Jados level jump. And the full game that we got to see him last year in a spot that he won and was his, you only got to see him against ACU, an FCS opponent. And then he gets hurt against Washington State. And what I did like about that situation, I guess if you're looking for silver linings, I like how quickly he said he was coming back. Like, he knew he was going to have that medical red shirt available to him, but it was, if I'm remembering correctly, very, very fast that he said, I'm back.
It was either in the post game,
yeah,
or McGuire's, Tuesday afternoon press conference. He said he's already asked.
Yeah.
Sciury's he loves being here. He loves the team. He's already asked about putting in that medical red shirt waiver.
That wascally waiver.
Yeah, so that is interesting in that respect. So And maybe that proves some things, but maybe Vinny Scurry's just a guy because when's the last time you went through a season with just 5 offensive linemen?
Sure.
Even not just like bring it in if you're running tempo a bunch and potentially 90 plays, which I hope you don't do as much this year. But even just like injuries and attrition in the college football game, like you probably need a 6th starter at some point, whether it's a game or 2 or the last 6. So that's why I say the depth here, I think, is the most interesting part of the offensive line. I do think you have 5 good. I'm not comparing them to Utah. I think Utah probably is the best offensive line in the Big 12. But as a unit, I think this offensive line is better than it has been in years past.
So, plenty of that better that we expect are from some of the new faces. Where do you want to start individually? You want to go Howard Sampson first?
Yeah, that's probably the premier name. Yeah, for sure.
I mean, arguably, to me, the most individual pressure of the transfer portal offensive lineman. Coming back to the Lone Star State, you're welcome. He'll have a couple seasons of eligibility, but as you said earlier, second best tackle in the portal. I think 14th best overall. He's coming to hold down the left tackle spot. Something that has been tricky not only for the Red Raiders, but can be tricky for just about, I don't know, we want to put it at like 85-90% of college football programs. But he's coming in to solidify and hopefully dominate that spot. Huge frame. I like that he has played big league football at North Carolina now. Obviously started at North Texas before that. But I think of all of those new faces on the offensive line, I think that there's the most riding on his shoulders to truly be that plug and play at the spot and say, just go play well. Hey, here's Baron Morton. Nobody sniffs him from your side of the line. And I think that's important too when you put in the conversation we're just talking about on the other side. It seems like there's been a little bit of a battle. It's like you just don't need to have to worry about that with him at all, or you shouldn't have to worry about that with him at all. And so I think that he might have the biggest expectation on the offensive line out of anybody.
Yeah, I think that a little bit like quarterback, it comes with the position. You're playing left tackle. And with a right-handed quarterback, that is the most important position on the offensive line. Maybe beyond center if you're calling protections and middle linebacker and blitzes and stuff. But, yeah, if you can be kind of a vocal leader at left tackle, and I don't know that Howard Sampson is a boisterous personality. He could be.
Who knows?
It seems like
could be at basketball games and introducing dunk contests.
Yeah. And I'll be interested to see who the captains are when they come out. If it is like a Sheridan Wilson or somebody off the offensive line, if it's Howard Sampson. But I don't think you can discount, like, if he's here for 1 year and gets drafted, great. Awesome. Because that means he was really good.
Right.
If he's here for 2 seasons and then gets drafted or whatever else, I think that's also good because then you got him for 2 seasons. So I'm very excited about him. He's a big guy. Mass kicks ass. Big people move little people. And that's kind of what Joey's been saying since his introductory press conference. Family show. So I do think that Howard Sampson, of the newcomers, of the returners, is probably the most crucial piece to Texas Tech really taking a step forward on the offensive line.
I think you have, and we'll find this out as we see him kind of up close and personal in the trenches there, and hopefully there's a couple of guys, but who's that tone setter as far as just being big and nasty? The guy that is just psycho-aggressive and is physically imposing. If you're going just, walking off the bus, it's Howard Sampson. And that's a total, it's not a knock on anybody else. It's more of a nod that he has that freak kind of build. And so, we have the fan question of the day that is going to pertain to the offensive line we'll get to towards the end of the program. But I think that he has, just from God-given frame, something that stands out compared to everybody else, and something that stands out across offensive lines and all of college football. And so can he also be that tone setter? We'll find out. Maybe it won't be him. Maybe it'll be someone else. I think you've got some other options. But as far as that conversation goes, I would love it to be him just from the spot that he's at. Let's go to Will Jados next.
Okay.
Do you feel like he's the forgotten offensive lineman from this class? We've talked about him, but the conversation around Hunter Zambrano, and he's the first one to commit from the class. And then Howard Sampson, again, just from how highly rated he was. Cash Cleveland was such a weird situation. Freshman All-American, how is he not on scholarship? What are you doing, Dion? Late May edition. I feel like Jados is, people, we got him too whenever you see the depth chart come out. And I think it's interesting. Miami of Ohio guy, as you said, he's moving. If the depth chart were to be true, that what we know now, he would be moving position from tackle to guard. I mean, he's not going to play left tackle here anyways, so it would be moving either way. But 3 seasons, over 2,000 snaps at that position for Miami of Ohio. I think like 9 sacks allowed over those 3 seasons, well over 1,000 opportunities. But again, you do the level jump and things like that. What do you think of Will Jados?
I thought Jados was a candidate to transfer in and transfer out pre-spring, post-spring.
Mm-hmm.
Because I thought immediately you out-recruited him when you got Howard Sampson. Because it was Zambrano first, and then Jados. And at the time, it was like, Jados is going to play right tackle. Zambrano is going to play right guard. And then the Davian Carter news drops that he's coming back. And it's like, he's probably playing right guard. One of these guys is coming in not to start for their final year of college football. And I thought Jados was the odd man out. Now he's, showing up at left guard. So I am not a football coach.
Mm-hmm.
I have watched some Will Jados tape. And by tape, I mean highlights and lowlights from Miami of Ohio, because it's hard to find full games and you can't ever watch like all 22 tape.
Not a lot of Red Hawks action popping up for coaching tape.
Yeah, so like zero disrespect, because if he won the job, he's going to win the job at left guard. He was the name I was surprised that was in the starting 5 when that came out. Not like shocked or like, what are they doing? This guy's a bum. No, I'm not doing that. It's just like, I guess he had a good spring.
To me, it's like the pleasant surprise, right?
Yeah.
Because it felt like, all right, Sciury's coming back. He's going to hold down a spot. And then you see him in a position battle. And to me, like, okay, well, that is obviously a positive from the coaching staff.
Yeah.
Because I know Sciury, obviously, again, coming off the injury, but a guy that was well-respected over there had, nailed down that spot last year. And all of a sudden you look up and you go, oh, okay, well, if it was going to be a position battle, I didn't quite think it would be Sciury, and I didn't think it would be with that pairing with Jados at that position. But to me, it goes back to the depth conversation, where that's a good thing. If you have these 2 older players battling out, that the coaching staff is going, both of these, because it does feel like that one is a true battle compared to Zambrano and Ponton's, where this really is like, hey, you see that on the depth chart, and there's the infamous slash, if you will, in between their names. So I'm excited to see what you get out of him if he does end up in that spot and is your main starter there. Another big frame, by the way. I mean, you can say, well, all offensive linemen are big, but he is
6'7".
He's huge.
6'7". But you also just look at his. I hate that I just did that. You look at his PFF grades, and he's like the one guy on the offensive line. And again, I reference PFF grades a lot because it's out there and it's really the only analytics you can get, but it's not really even analytics. Where Carter and Sheridan Wilson shine as pass blockers and are probably less than shiny run blockers. Jados is the opposite. Like, he's a run blocking tackle. And so maybe you just want that spot if you're going to run some inside zone or, even some wide zone that you want him moving out and taking care of those tackles. So maybe that's the decision there, that he's a guy that maybe does not defend premier edge rushers in the Big 12, is a guy that can move Dominic Orange at Iowa State or Dante Corleone at Cincinnati if you happen to meet those teams at the end.
Yeah.
I don't think you'd meet Cincinnati at the end, but stranger things have happened.
It would be quite the season from
Arizona State did it last year.
young Sorsby.
Yeah.
Hunter Zambrano, another one of the names we've talked about in passing, is in that battle at right tackle. FCS level player. Just 2 games last year before he was injured. Came in with all sorts of preseason stuff. Was getting NFL draft grade and stuff like that. And unfortunately, did not get to play out that season. So then you bring him in, and I think you can maybe have this conversation whenever we go defensive backs, or I guess the secondary, excuse me, because it's safety, but with Cole Wisniewski, another guy that had to sit out all of last year, but also doing the jump up from a level. But this is going, hey, can you protect and move people at this level and also off of an injury? I think he is an interesting case that, if you're talking about scouts and stuff, they're not worried about it. And you wouldn't be bringing him in if you weren't worried about it. And I go back to with that position battle with Ponton, I think it's more to do with what they like about Jacob Ponton and less to do with like, ooh, this is not the cat we thought we were bringing in.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested in his season. I do think, I'm with you, I think he'll start at the number 1 on the depth chart over there when the season comes around, and hopefully we'll hold down that position. But I like that you do have a push over there, but I also like how much football Zambrano has played, and I certainly like the upside.
Yeah. And Zambrano, let's just double check his size. Because Davian Carter is a wide body.
Mm-hmm.
Not like, he's about 300. But the right side of your offensive line is much smaller than the left side of your offensive line. Now, again, that's 6'7", 6'9", 305, 310 over there, 320. Like, that's a giant left side of your offensive line. You're kind of like the Eagles at that point.
If you're going left tackle, 340, and then if it's Jados, I think 310. So it's like 6'8", 340, 6'7", 310.
Yeah, and then on the other side,
it's like a cell phone tower.
Yeah. On the other side is Davian Carter, but Zambrano's 6'5", which I did not remember him being that tall, but 6'5", 305. But again, it's 6'8", 340, 6'5", 300, and then the right guard is maybe he's listed at 6 feet.
Yeah,
and then 300. So maybe you're running left a lot.
Tech has him at 295. They don't want to get him up to the 3 number.
Yeah, maybe you run left a lot.
What's interesting about his tape at Illinois State is, I'm not saying that the FCS doesn't have like big bodies or anything down there, or like they're playing Division III teams, but still, I think whenever his tape was flying around when he'd first committed, it was like, he looks bigger. He looks the part. Like he looks like. And you weren't the only one interested in him, by the way. He committed really quickly to you in the portal. But you weren't the only one after him. And I think that's something that did stand out about his size. Again, it's still not what you have on the left side. But like to what you're saying, I think he's a little bit bigger than what people think. And I wonder if that is the FCS effect. Or, it's someone that we haven't watched very much, or we haven't seen in person very much, anything like that. I get it, but I just do think that's something a little bit interesting. He's not like a small fry over there. The other thing, Jacob Ponton is huge, who he's battling with, and I think this is a big piece of the conversation with the offensive line as well, and it's something you can talk about the defensive line. I mean, you got some bodies that you haven't, some body styles and types that you have not seen on a Red Raider roster in your trenches, and the big people move little people. I think you are hopefully going to finally be able to really, really hit on that. I'm with you from something that you said earlier. I think the offensive line has been good. You don't get the numbers you get without, if they were just playing as horrid and awful as people claimed that they were. But I just don't think they took this massive step forward. And you certainly weren't a dominant offensive line. And I'm not sure if you even had a truly just dominant game last year, but you had really good games. You also had some really bad games. And you had some games where you could say this about the entire team. You had both sides of that conversation in the same matchup. It just depended on the quarter of the drive. But you've got some big-time measurables, if you will, from what you have on the offensive line. Last one for the new faces, Cash Cleveland. Again, just what a strange situation over at Colorado. Freshman All-American center. I get he was brought in as a walk-on and had to earn that spot. By the time he earned that spot, it's like, how are you not trying to keep him around? How are you not trying to take care of him? And he says, see you later. Ends up as a Red Raider. I think as good of a situation as you could ask for, because if he came in and if he beat out Sheridan Wilson, I think that would be good, because you know what you have with Sheridan Wilson. If he backs up Sheridan Wilson, you have a Big 12 capable, again, young, red shirt still on the table for him, right? I mean, you could see him in 4 games,
that's a dream,
and red, that's perfect situation kind of conversation. Again, late addition in the portal. That was David Bailey was the cherry on top, the massive cherry on top to the portal class. But Cash Cleveland could fit in that conversation as well, because it's from the timing of it, seemed like you were done getting offensive linemen, and if you hadn't gotten Cash Cleveland, the work that you did was great. But he's a very welcomed addition for now, but even more importantly, for the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny, he gets his first action here in Lubbock.
His first start, right? No, he came in.
He came in.
Okay.
And then from there on out, he was the starter.
Yeah.
And then we got a good look at him, and we're like, hey, if he wants to come over here.
He whipped your tails as the walk-on true freshman. That was a talking point after that game.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they got a walk-on true freshman over there. They're kicking their tails on the defense line.
Turns out he's really good.
I think your defense tackles are going to be better this year, but I do think that he had a really good game. One last point on that, just speaking to the depth you have. If Cash Cleveland and Sheridan Wilson and Hunter and Howard Sampson and Ponton are all kind of anchoring the offensive line next year, and then you're adding in an Ellis Davis or some of these other young guys you're building up, now you're really cooking. Because I don't think it's sustainable, like you did on the defensive line, to bring in 4 starters a year. And I don't think it's sustainable at the offensive. And maybe it is in today's college football if you're going to spend as much money as you did in this portal class to do it that way. But I really like to build the trenches with some returners.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the new offensive coordinator kind of throws that out anyways. But as excited I am potentially for this offensive line, I'm like twice as excited for next year's offensive line.
I think he can throw in like maybe a Connor Carty, Daniel Sill,
Sure.
Holton Hendricks, like those kind of names. I think it's also important, though, like if you find success with these guys and like with Howard Sampson, whether he's here after next year or not, that you can turn into, you're looking at other portal guys that might be top offensive line prospects and mixing it in. I think homegrown offensive linemen, it's really important to be able to do that. But, if you can set the standard and go, hey, top offensive guard, look what we've been able to do here. Suddenly, we're getting offensive linemen consistently to the league, and you can start with Caleb Rogers from what this era is, and then hopefully some other guys, or, you're succeeding at that spot. All of a sudden, you can become offensive line bait, if you will. I think that's really important to be able to mix those two things together. And that's why it adds the importance of playing well with that unit and with some of these individual guys this season. So let's talk about improvement. What is improvement with this unit from last year?
Yeah, you have to find more consistency. I think Taj Brooks got 1,500 yards in spite of the offensive line at times.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be better at run blocking. Taj could handle contact in the backfield and get 5 yards. Maybe these guys can run around some people. Maybe Cam Dickey can run through some guys. But you have to be better at the point of attack. And you asked earlier, who's the nasty leader? Who's going to set the tone, the edge? I don't think you had that last year. Caleb Rogers, for how great he was as a vocal leader, was more of a rah-rah guy.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing wrong with that. I think those guys are needed. But I need a guy who's going to spit in your mouth and bang their head on the locker and come out with blood in their eyes. Right? Program?
Yeah. Uh-huh. Still an image.
Yeah, it's a nasty image, isn't it?
Yeah, it's disgusting.
And so, no, not disgusting, nasty.
It's disgusting.
So I don't know if you have that. I don't know if Howard Sampson's that kind of guy. I don't know if even Vinny Scurry coming back or Will
It's like
Jados
saying,
or
we don't
Sam
need
Brown.
hand sanitizer in the locker room. We need a bunch of germs out there.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, germ blast. I think you certainly need that, right?
Yeah, no, I
You need
agree
blast.
with you.
And so if you can find that edge, like if I always thought that Hamby, as a guy who played with that edge during his time at Texas Tech, would be able to incite that in his offensive line, and it never felt like you got there. Not that they're soft, they don't play with that edge, right? And so you have to find an edge. If you want to be better offensively, and you were good offensively last year, but if you want to be better, if you want to win the Big 12, if you want to be in Arlington, you have to find that edge on the offensive line where you're not just getting your blocks, you're not just executing, you're moving people.
I think what you are, from an offensive line standpoint, what you are seeking to be, again, you don't have to be just like the greatest offensive line in college football history. You don't need to just be this exceedingly jump off the page kind of OL group. But I think when you're looking around the Big 12 and you go, okay, what's different about Utah? What's different about Kansas State? What's different about Iowa State? What's different about some of the Cincinnati lines that they've seen over there? They are just salty and maybe play with a purpose makes it seem like a shot, but everything that they do seems intentional. And there's an intimidation factor with it. And that plays in. That's why we always go, oh, they're hard nosed. And it's like, well, you've got other positions on the team and from other programs in the Big 12 that I would go as hard nosed. But from the offensive line, those schools have kind of earned those reputations. So Can you get into that conversation with your play this year? And speaking of like Cincinnati, so the Cincinnati game this year, I think this is like what I personally am looking for against the Bearcats. You didn't dominate them, but you held your own. Didn't allow a sack in that game. I thought you gave your offense plenty of opportunities from the offensive line against a defensive line that didn't really have that great of a pass rush and was pretty average, right? Mm-hmm. Can that be your baseline whenever we're talking about your play when you go to Manhattan or when you have grown men from BYU coming to town?
Or Rice Eccles.
Yes.
I think Utah's a really good front line.
When you see those teams, can we have the same feeling that we did against Cincinnati, maybe a subpar defensive front last year?
Yeah, beyond Corleone, yeah.
To the conversation this year when you're playing some of those better units.
Yeah, you said a phrase in there that I think encapsulates the Texas Tech offensive line experience in the last decade. Hold your own. Mm-hmm. They've held their own. They have had bad games. They have had games, especially in the Wells era, where you just get off the bus and you're a loser.
Mm-hmm.
Oklahoma, Texas, at times. And if you can just be the opposite, if you can be the offensive line where they get off the bus and they're like, yeah, we don't know if we can compete. We think we can.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't know. Like, that's what you're striving for. I don't know that this offensive line is that. I think they're more that than previous years. And I don't need Brandon Carter face paint from Will Jados. And I don't need some kind of I don't need some kind of personal foul to prove they're being nasty out there. I don't need cheap shots. I don't need injuries. But what I'm looking for is if Baron Morton's hit at the end of a whistle, there's 3 offensive linemen over there pushing the defensive end and picking up their quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
I want to see a Michael Orr block 15 yards downfield when the whistle blows. Inside the game, inside the whistle. Because I think another thing that Texas Tech's offensive line
go home.
has not really done.
Took him to the bus.
It's not really done is play through the whistle. I think you've struggled with that a little bit. And like you've seen Taj Brooks, now not all the time, but I think consistency is another thing here. You've seen Taj Brooks pushing a pile, and then it's like, oh, the 3 offensive linemen are going to come up and be like, oh yeah, we should be pushing this pile. And sometimes it was just Taj Brooks. So those kind of like finishing every play kind of stuff. I think that's a step that they need to take. And paper, I think this offensive line is the most talented you've had. Can they get that mentality?
I'm going to steal a phrase from a local high school coach here that I really enjoy talking with, and he always says they're telling their offensive line, "Hey, everybody's looking at you, like you're superstars," and you don't get that mentality.
Yep.
Like everybody's watching you, every single play, so treat it like that. And so, I think maybe taking the ownership 100% of the time is certainly a step, and the consistency is something I think we brought up in every single episode, but it's because that was one of the biggest stories from last year's team up and down the roster was consistency. And I don't think this year, which by the way, when I was talking about like, hey, can you have that feeling against Cincinnati, against the better defensive lines, I also want to see you go out and dominate a couple of games. As otherwise, I don't think that you'll be the team that gets to Arlington. I think you'll be the team that gets close to Arlington and in the same boat that you've been in. So when you play maybe some of the subpar defensive lines this year, can you make it look different? And the other side of that too, when you do face a good pass rush or a good front, I'll say this, I don't think you're going perfect this year. But if you drop a game or two, I'm going to be really disappointed if it does look like Colorado. I just don't want to see a game anywhere near that. Even if it was just a one-off, that goes back into the conversation. Okay, you weren't there to compete game in and game out. You weren't there every single week.
Yeah, and if you're just looking at units as like if you're in Arlington at the end of the year, if you're not in Arlington at the end of the year, I think you have a top 5 unit at receiver in the Big 12, like top to bottom.
Yeah.
I think you have a top 7 running back unit. Maybe as a group, they move up a little bit, inch up a little bit. I think you certainly have a top 6 quarterback in the Big 12. So I think you need to have the offensive line be a top 3 unit to really dominate and exert your will. So can this unit be that? I hope so. But I do think there are still question marks on this offensive line because how this program has built and played in years past, recent past.
It's like if you look at it on paper, this should be a better unit. And on paper is a very dangerous conversation because you're going, all right, yeah, the size is there. The game experience for most of these guys is there. You have a perfect mix of some new faces, fresh blood. You have some guys that have already performed well as Red Raiders. I do think another fair question is chemistry and gelling. And again, this is where I look at some of your returning guys. Like this is something that you need to help with, and then new guys, you need to just come in and do your job. But I think the athleticism, the strength, all of that stuff is there. And so now it's just, can you make it work? Can you get it to that point where we're going, yes, definitively, you took a big step with that unit. So speaking of rankings, if you were to make it to Arlington, let me ask you this: where does this unit rank for maybe like make or break this season compared to other position groups when you're looking around the roster?
Yeah, offensively, as I just said, it's number 1. Like, you have to be above average at offensive line. Because I think if you want to say Baron Morton was a bus driver and the three running backs as a unit kind of got to where the room got to last year, and you're about 2,000 yards between the three of them, and tight ends and wide receivers kind of do what we expect. Like, the biggest window of good and bad, I think, is this offensive line. I think they could be the number 2 offensive line in the Big 12. I think they could be the 10th best offensive line in the Big 12.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the make or break. Because I think you know what you have in the running backs. I think you know what you have in Barry Morton. I think you know what you have with the pass catchers. Even with Mac Leftwich to an extent, even though he's not been at this level, I think you know what you're going to see, at least with this roster. I think it's the biggest gap, the make or break of it is the offensive line.
It's like we have way more faith in the defensive line.
Yeah.
But
apparently they're number 3 in the country according to some publications.
I think that this is a 1A. It's a very staple football conversation, right? Like, you got to win in the trenches.
Yeah.
You big boys got to be big boys, all that stuff. You men have to be men.
But if I said, legitimately, and I think I shot low on some of these offensive projections, but if I said at the end of the year the Big 12's best defensive line was Texas Tech, would you balk at that?
No, I wouldn't.
If I said the linebacker unit at Texas Tech's the best in the Big 12, would you balk at that?
No, I wouldn't.
I don't think I would either. And then if I said you have a top 5 secondary, I don't think I'm balking too much at that either. Probably that's the one you kind of say, well, I don't know. We'll have to see how Pollock and Balfour and some of these newcomers, Wisniewski.
If you said top 8, I'd be like, well, I expected them to be top 8.
Certainly
yes.
top half. But I think, projection-wise, especially if Chapman Lewis comes back at the end of the year, and Dingle, I watched some Houston tape, and we'll talk about Shieldwood next week, but that star over there is more of a linebacker than
right.
We've played with here. And I'm really excited about him playing that position. So I just don't think there's as big of a window at any other position than offensive line.
I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I think that this is why it's important. You are specifically the defensive line. You have put that unit together with the biggest expectation, and like you have to be that superstar group that you're being projected to. Offensive line, I don't necessarily think that they have to be a superstar group, but they have to be really good. And if they're anything past that, then I mean that's on the plus side. I think you can get to Arlington with a quote unquote really good year from the offensive line.
Yes.
But it's 1A, 1B, and it's coming from different angles because you're not asking the same level of play from the defensive line that you are from your offensive line. So let's go to the fan question of the week. You have any other thoughts before we?
No, let's do it.
You can submit a question of the week. Just make sure to mention Red Raider Recon with either of our personal Twitters or Double T97.3. Just make sure to again link our show so we know it's for us. The question this week: what offensive lineman's season are you the most interested in?
Yeah, I think we answered this through the course of our conversations, but I'll double down. Yeah, I'll double down with Howard Sampson. I think left tackle. I think if you're in Arlington, if you have a top unit, if all of those things happen, it's because Howard Sampson is the real deal at left tackle. Mm-hmm. So I would say Howard Sampson. I think that's a position, too, you've just needed to be better.
Yeah.
Even when Caleb Rogers was over at left tackle several years ago, even when you had some consistency with the starter or whatnot, you've not had an above-average left tackle for a full season. If he can provide that, similar to what you had in the quarterback conversation, it's like, well, just like let's have a guy start 12 games and see what happens. So I think if you can get that, I think you'll be much, much better.
We have the same answer. I don't want to be boring here, but I mean, if Carter and Wilson are the gel pieces, he's got to be the anchor. Mm-hmm. I think that's what you're planning on, what you're expecting from him. And also, I mean, even if it wasn't that, he's just a spectacle because he is massive even compared to other massive bodies. Again, 6'8", 340. I mean, if he doesn't make it in the NFL down the line, maybe pops up on NXT, something like that, I'd be interested.
Sure.
And I just think he needs to be a standout freak. If I gave you a second answer, though, this is kind of cheating because there's an if involved. If either early on or later down the season, Jacob Ponton did work into the starting lineup, suddenly I am very, very interested. I mean, I'm interested in him anyways, and this isn't a shot at Zambrano or like, oh, the older guy won the position, boring.
Right.
Because that's what you want to happen.
Yeah.
But if it was Ponton, for whatever reason, I would suddenly be bumping him up the list.
Yeah, and again, boomer bust type guy. I think Will Jados, if he wins that job and is the guy, I think that's another thing where you look at and say, how can you not run the football left?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Especially if you have a tight end over there, or even if you're just setting the edge with those two guys and you're tracking the other two guys across and they're just washing the defensive line. Even if it's Zambrano and a tight end pulling across like Kitley did so much last year, like surely Sampson and Jados and Sharon Wilson could wash them guys.
Again, I think that's part of the question of that next step mentality. But I've had a lot of fun going over the offense.
Yeah.
We're wrapping up the offensive portion here this week, which means next week, as you said, we will go to Shieldwood and we'll start the defensive portion, which, man, that's going to be equally fun to go over. Some speaking of that superstar type of feel, feels like you've got some all Big 12 guys at every level over there. We'll have a lot of fun talking about that too. Hopefully you've had fun with us here today, talking about the hog mollies, the big daddies, the big nasties, the beef. We'll see you next week.